The stranger rode into Aurora, Colorado on a horse that looked like it had crossed the entire territory twice without rest. And when he dismounted near the creek that ran behind the old Henderson place, he saw something that made him stop mid-step and stare like he had stumbled upon a miracle in the dirt. Vincent Mercer had spent the better part of 1881 driving cattle from Texas up through the Goodnight-loving trail, his hands calloused from rope burns and his back aching from sleeping on hard ground for months at a stretch. He had arrived in Aurora with nothing but a worn saddle, a horse that deserved better than him, and $43 in his pocket that he had earned the hard way. The foreman back in Texas had told him there was work to be found in Colorado, that the mining towns were hungry for beef and willing to pay. So Vincent had pointed his mare north and kept riding until the mountains rose up like cathedral spires against the sky. But now, standing at the edge of Catherine Ashford's property, he forgot all about finding work or food or a place to sleep that did not involve the cold ground and a thin bedroll. What he saw instead was a young woman kneeling in the tall grass, with the afternoon sun turning her hair the color of honey, and surrounding her in a peculiar arrangement were tin cans. Not just a few tin cans, but dozens of them, rusted and dented, each one buzzing with the unmistakable sound of honeybees. Vincent watched as she lifted one of the cans with careful hands, peering inside with such concentration that she did not notice him standing there like a fool. The bees swirled around her in lazy circles, landing on her bare forearms and the collar of her faded blue dress, but she did not flinch or swat them away. Instead, she murmured something too soft for him to hear, and Vincent felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the thin mountain air. He cleared his throat, not wanting to startle her, but knowing he could not just stand there watching her like some kind of drifter with bad intentions. She turned sharply, nearly dropping the tin can, and her eyes went wide as she took in his dusty clothes and the revolver hanging from his belt. "I did not mean to frighten you," Vincent said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I was just passing through, and I saw you here with the bees." Catherine stood slowly, setting the tin can down with deliberate care before brushing the dirt from her skirt. Up close, Vincent could see that she was younger than he had first thought, maybe 22 or 23, with green eyes that studied him with equal parts wariness and curiosity. "Most people run when they see bees," she said, and her voice had a quality to it that reminded him of wind moving through aspens. "I grew up around them," Vincent replied, which was true enough. His mother had kept 3 proper hives back in Missouri before the fever took her, and he remembered the way she had moved among them like they were old friends. "But I have never seen anyone keep them in tin cans before." Something flickered across Catherine's face, and Vincent realized too late that his observation might have sounded like criticism. But instead of taking offense, she glanced back at her makeshift apiary and let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "It is not by choice," she admitted. "The proper hives I had were destroyed in a storm last spring. I have been trying to keep the colonies alive any way I can, but tin cans are hardly ideal. The heat gets trapped inside, and there is no proper ventilation, and I lose more bees every week." Vincent looked at the arrangement of cans again, seeing now what he had missed before. This was not the work of someone ignorant or careless. This was desperation, the kind that came from trying to hold onto something important when the world kept taking things away. "How many colonies do you have?" he asked. 10, Catherine said. "Or I did before the storm. Now I am down to these, and I do not know how much longer they will last." The number struck Vincent as significant, though he could not say why. 10 colonies in proper hives could produce enough honey to sell, enough to make a real living if you knew what you were doing. 10 colonies in tin cans were just a tragedy waiting to happen. He found himself saying, "I could build you proper hives," before he had fully thought through what that would mean. Catherine stared at him like he had just offered to lasso the moon. "You are a stranger," she said slowly. "I do not even know your name." "Vincent Mercer," he said, taking off his hat in a gesture that felt awkward and old-fashioned even as he did it. "And you are right, I am a stranger. But I know how to work wood, and I know what bees need, and if you have the materials, I could have 10 hives built by sundown." It was an outrageous claim, the kind of boast that men made when they were trying to impress a woman. But Vincent meant every word. He had spent enough time working with his hands to know what he was capable of, and the thought of those bees suffocating in tin cans made something in him rebel. Maybe it was because of his mother, or maybe it was because Catherine was looking at him like she wanted to believe him, but had been disappointed too many times before. Either way, Vincent knew he was going to build those hives even if it meant working straight through until dark. "I have some old lumber behind the barn," Catherine said finally, "left over from when my father was trying to expand the chicken coop before he passed, and there are tools in the shed, though I cannot promise they are in good condition." "That will work," Vincent said. He was already calculating measurements in his head, remembering the dimensions of the hives his mother had used. A Langstroth hive was not complicated, just a series of boxes stacked on top of each other with frames inside for the bees to build their combs. If the lumber was decent and the saw was sharp, he could work fast. Catherine studied him for another long moment, and Vincent had the strange sensation that she was looking past his dusty clothes and trail-worn face to something deeper. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded once and said, "My name is Catherine Ashford, and if you can truly build 10 hives by sundown, I will make you the best dinner you have had in months." Vincent felt his lips pull into a smile, the first genuine one in longer than he could remember. "Deal," he said. They walked together toward the barn, with Catherine pointing out the property boundaries and explaining how she had ended up alone on this piece of land. Her father had died 2 winters ago, she said, and her mother had passed when Catherine was still a child. There were no siblings, no other family to help her manage the farm, so she had learned to do everything herself. The bees had been her father's passion, something he had started as a hobby that turned into a small business selling honey to the general store in town and to some of the mining camps in the mountains. "After the storm destroyed the hives, I did not have money to buy new ones," Catherine explained as they reached the barn. "The lumber was expensive, and I did not know how to build them properly myself, so I started using whatever I could find. Tin cans, old crates, even a few ceramic pots that I thought might work. But nothing has been right, and I keep losing colonies." Vincent could hear the frustration in her voice, and underneath that, the fear. This was not just about honey or money. This was about holding on to the last piece of her father, the one thing that connected her to him now that he was gone. He understood that kind of grief, the way it could make you do desperate things just to keep a memory alive. The lumber behind the barn was better than he had expected, planks of pine that had weathered but were still solid. Vincent ran his hands over the wood, checking for rot or insect damage, and found only a few pieces that would need to be discarded. The tools in the shed were another matter. The saw was dull, the hammer had a loose handle, and the nails were rusted, but Vincent had worked with worse. He set about sharpening the saw first, using a whetstone he found buried under a pile of old burlap sacks, and then he began measuring and cutting. Catherine stayed nearby, watching him work with an intensity that might have made him nervous if he had been a different kind of man. But Vincent had spent too many years working cattle drives, where every decision could mean the difference between getting the herd to market or losing half of them to drought or stampede. He was used to pressure, used to people depending on him to know what he was doing even when he was making it up as he went along. Building hives was different from herding cattle, but the principle was the same. You broke the job down into steps, and you worked through each step with focus and precision until it was done. The first hive took him nearly an hour because he had to reacquaint himself with the measurements and make sure the pieces fit together properly. But by the time he started on the second hive, his hands remembered the rhythm and he worked faster. Catherine brought him water from the well, cool and sweet, and he drank it down without stopping, barely pausing before he returned to sawing and hammering. "You are not lying," Catherine said as she watched him fit the third hive together. "You really do know what you are doing." "My mother taught me," Vincent said, driving a nail home with 3 efficient strikes. "She used to say that bees were God's way of reminding people that hard work and patience could create something sweet. I did not understand what she meant when I was young, but I think I do now." Catherine was quiet for a moment, and when Vincent glanced up, he saw that she was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," she said softly. "She was," Vincent agreed. He did not add that his mother had also been dead for 15 years, or that he still missed her in ways that surprised him at the strangest moments. Some things did not need to be said out loud. The afternoon wore on, and Vincent fell into a state of concentration so deep that he barely noticed the passage of time. He worked through the heat of the day, sweat dripping down his back and soaking through his shirt, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Cut, measure, fit, nail. Over and over until the pile of lumber shrank and the stack of completed hives grew. Catherine helped where she could, holding pieces steady while he nailed them together, fetching more nails when he ran low, cleaning up the sawdust that accumulated around his feet. They did not talk much, but the silence between them was comfortable in a way that Vincent had not experienced with another person in years. There was something calming about working alongside someone who understood the value of steady, focused effort, who did not feel the need to fill every moment with meaningless chatter. Catherine seemed to sense when he needed her help, and when he needed to work alone, and Vincent found himself appreciating her quiet competence more than he would have expected. By the time he started on the 8th hive, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Vincent's shoulders ached and his hands were covered in new splinters, but he kept working. He had made a promise and he intended to keep it. 2 more hives. He could do this. Catherine disappeared into the house and returned with a jar of honey and a piece of bread. "You need to eat," she said, and there was no room for argument in her tone. Vincent took the food gratefully, eating standing up while he eyed the remaining lumber and calculated how much time he had left. The honey was incredible, rich and complex with flavors he could not quite name, and he said so. "That is from last year's harvest," Catherine said. "Before I lost the proper hives. The bees were foraging on wildflowers up in the hills, and you can taste the difference. This year, if I can even get a harvest, it will not be the same." "It will be," Vincent said with more confidence than he felt. "Once the bees are in proper hives, they will thrive. You will see." He finished the 9th hive just as the sun touched the peaks of the mountains, flooding the valley with deep amber light. 1 more. Vincent's hands were cramping now, and he could feel blisters forming on his palms, but he pushed through the pain and started on the final hive. Catherine worked beside him, her hands quick and sure as she helped him fit the pieces together. They moved like they had been working together for years instead of hours, anticipating each other's movements, passing tools back and forth without needing to speak. When Vincent drove the last nail into the 10th hive, the sun was balanced on the very edge of the mountains, a perfect sphere of fire that would be gone in minutes. He straightened up, his back protesting the movement, and looked at what they had accomplished. 10 hives stood in a neat row beside the barn, their fresh-cut wood pale and clean in the fading light. They were not perfect. Vincent could see a dozen little flaws that would bother him if he thought about them too long. But they were solid and well-made, and most importantly, they would give the bees what they needed to survive and thrive. "You did it," Catherine said, and her voice was full of wonder. "You actually did it." Vincent turned to look at her and found that she was smiling, a real smile that transformed her whole face and made her eyes shine. Something in his chest tightened, and he realized with startling clarity that he did not want to leave this place. He did not want to ride away tomorrow and never see Catherine Ashford again. The thought was absurd. He had known her for less than a day. But there it was anyway, stubborn and insistent, refusing to be ignored. "We should move the bees before it gets dark," he said, because that was easier than examining the feelings that were churning through him. "They will be calmer now that the sun is setting, and it will be less stressful for them if we do it quickly." Moving the bees from the tin cans to the proper hives was delicate work that required patience and care. Vincent showed Catherine how to approach each can slowly, speaking to the bees in a low, calm voice to keep them from panicking. They worked together, lifting each can and carefully transferring the frames of comb into the new hives, making sure the queen was safely moved with each colony. The bees buzzed in confusion at first, but as they began to explore their new homes, Vincent could see them settling, spreading out through the boxes with what looked almost like relief. By the time they finished moving the last colony, full darkness had fallen, and the stars were coming out overhead in brilliant profusion. Vincent's arms felt like they might fall off, and his hands were shaking with exhaustion, but he felt satisfied in a way he had not experienced in a long time. Catherine stood beside him, her own hands covered in wax and propolis, looking at the row of hives like they were made of gold instead of pine lumber. "I do not know how to thank you," she said quietly. "This is more than I could have hoped for." "You promised me dinner," Vincent reminded her, and was rewarded with another one of those smiles that made his heart do strange things in his chest. The house was small but well kept, with whitewashed walls and curtains in the windows that Catherine had clearly sewn herself. She lit lamps while Vincent washed his hands at the pump outside, scrubbing away the dirt and sawdust and dried blood from the splinters. When he came inside, the smell of cooking food made his stomach clench with hunger. He could not remember the last time he had eaten a meal that had not been cooked over a campfire or bought from a trail town saloon. Catherine had put together a meal of fried chicken, potatoes, green beans from her garden, and fresh bread slathered with butter and honey. It was simple food, but to Vincent, it tasted like the best thing he had ever eaten. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, and for a while neither of them spoke, too busy eating to worry about conversation. Finally, Catherine set down her fork and said, "What were you planning to do in Aurora? Before you stopped here, I mean." Vincent finished chewing before he answered. "I was looking for work," he said honestly. "Cattle work, ranch work, anything that would pay. I have been driving cattle for the past 3 years, but I am tired of the trail. I want to settle somewhere, put down roots." "Is that why you stopped here?" Catherine asked. "Because you thought I might need help on the farm?" Vincent considered lying, or at least softening the truth, but something in Catherine's gaze made him want to be honest. "I stopped because I saw you with the bees," he said, "and I could not ride away without helping." It did not seem right, seeing them in those tin cans when I knew how to build something better." Catherine's expression softened, and she looked down at her plate like she was trying to hide some emotion that Vincent could not quite identify. "That is kind of you," she said finally. "Most men would have just kept riding." "I am not most men," Vincent said, and immediately felt like an idiot for saying something so obvious and self-important. But Catherine looked up at him with those green eyes, and instead of laughing at him, she nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. "No," she agreed. "I do not think you are." They finished the meal in companionable silence, and afterward, Catherine insisted on making coffee while Vincent sat at the table and tried not to fall asleep where he sat. The exhaustion was catching up with him now that the work was done, and food was in his belly, and he could feel his body demanding rest. But he did not want to leave yet, did not want to walk out into the darkness and find somewhere to make camp when he could stay here a little longer and talk to Catherine. She brought him coffee in a chipped ceramic mug, and the bitter warmth of it helped push back the exhaustion. "You can sleep in the barn if you want," Catherine offered, and then quickly added, "I mean if you need a place to stay tonight. It is not much, but there is hay and it is dry, and it would be better than sleeping outside." Vincent wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he would be fine, but the truth was he was too tired to ride anywhere tonight, and the thought of sleeping in a barn that did not smell like cattle or sweat sounded like luxury. "That is generous of you," he said. "I would appreciate it." "It is the least I can do," Catherine replied. "After what you did today." They sat there at the kitchen table drinking coffee and talking as the night deepened around them. Catherine told him about growing up on this property, about her father teaching her to read the land and understand the rhythms of the seasons. She talked about her mother, who had died of pneumonia when Catherine was only 8, leaving her father to raise her alone. She described the loneliness of the past 2 years since her father had passed, the way the silence of the house sometimes felt like it might swallow her whole. Vincent found himself telling her things he rarely spoke about. He talked about his mother and the hives she had kept in Missouri, about how his father had been a merchant who died when Vincent was 12, leaving them with debts that took years to pay off. He described the restlessness that had driven him west after his mother died, the need to move and keep moving because staying in one place meant confronting the grief that followed him like a shadow. He explained how he had drifted from job to job, ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. "You ever get tired of moving?" Catherine asked. The lamp on the table flickered, casting shifting shadows across her face. "Every day," Vincent admitted. "But I have not found a reason to stop yet." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, and Vincent had the strange sensation that she was about to say something important, something that might change the direction of both their lives. But instead, she stood up and began clearing the dishes, and the moment passed. "You must be exhausted," she said. "Let me show you to the barn." The barn was exactly what Vincent had expected. A solid structure that smelled of hay and old wood, and the faint musk of animals that had been housed there years ago. Catherine showed him where she kept extra blankets, apologizing for their threadbare condition, and pointed out the ladder to the loft where the hay was cleanest and driest. She lingered at the barn door for a moment, silhouetted against the starlight, and Vincent wished he had the words to tell her what this day had meant to him. "Thank you," he said instead, inadequate as it was. "Sleep well, Vincent," Catherine replied. And then she was gone, walking back toward the house with her skirts swishing in the darkness. Vincent climbed up to the loft and spread out the blankets over the hay, making a nest that was far more comfortable than it had any right to be. He lay down and looked up at the barn roof, where gaps in the boards let him see fragments of the night sky. His body ached in a dozen places, but it was the good kind of ache that came from honest work, from building something with his own hands that would last and matter. He thought about Catherine alone in that house, thought about her tending those bees in tin cans, because she refused to give up on her father's legacy. He thought about the way she had smiled when she saw the finished hives, and the way her eyes had looked in the lamplight. And he thought about how, for the first time in years, he did not want morning to come because morning would mean deciding whether to stay or ride on. Sleep took him before he could resolve that question, pulling him down into dreams of honeybees and green eyes and the smell of fresh cut pine. Vincent woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and pale morning light filtering through the gaps in the barn roof. For a moment he was disoriented, his mind still caught between sleep and waking, but then memory returned and he sat up quickly. The events of the previous day felt almost dreamlike in their intensity. Had he really built 10 hives in a single afternoon? Had he really sat at a kitchen table with Catherine Ashford and talked until the lamps burned low? He climbed down from the loft, brushing hay from his clothes and running his fingers through his hair in a futile attempt to look presentable. Outside, the morning was cool and clear, the kind of early summer day that promised heat later but was perfect for now. Vincent walked toward the row of hives, wanting to check on the bees and make sure they had settled into their new homes overnight. What he found made him stop and stare in wonder. The bees were already active, streaming in and out of the hive entrances in steady lines, their bodies golden in the morning sun. Some were returning laden with pollen, their leg sacs bulging with yellow and orange dust from whatever flowers they had been visiting. The hives hummed with activity, a sound that was both peaceful and purposeful, and Vincent felt a deep satisfaction knowing that he had helped make this possible. They sound happy. He turned to find Catherine standing a few yards away, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked younger somehow, less careworn than she had yesterday. "They do," Vincent agreed. "They have already started foraging, which is a good sign. It means they are comfortable in the new hives." Catherine walked closer, standing beside him to watch the bees. "I could not sleep last night," she admitted. "I kept coming to the window to look at the hives, to make sure I had not dreamed the whole thing. Part of me still cannot believe you did all that in one day." "I made a promise," Vincent said simply. "Yes, you did." Catherine turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. "Will you stay for breakfast? I am making eggs and bacon, and I have fresh milk from the neighbor's cow." Vincent knew he should probably decline, should thank her for the hospitality and be on his way. He had work to find, a life to figure out, and staying longer would only make it harder to leave. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "I would like that very much." They walked back to the house together, not touching but close enough that Vincent was intensely aware of her presence beside him. Catherine moved around her kitchen with efficient grace, cracking eggs into a skillet and slicing thick strips of bacon from a side she kept in the cold cellar. Vincent offered to help, but she waved him to a chair and told him to sit and rest. "You did enough work yesterday to last a month," she said firmly. "This morning, you are my guest." So Vincent sat and watched her cook, and tried not to think about how easy it would be to get used to this. The morning light coming through the windows, the smell of bacon frying, the simple pleasure of having someone to share breakfast with. These were the things he had told himself he did not need. The comforts he had convinced himself were for other men, men who were not restless and broken in the ways he was. But sitting in Catherine's kitchen, Vincent felt something shift inside him, like a door he had kept locked was starting to open. Maybe he was not as broken as he thought. Maybe he could have this kind of life, if he was willing to stop running and take a chance on staying. They ate breakfast together, talking about small things. Catherine mentioned that she needed to repair the fence on the east side of her property before the summer storms came. Vincent told her about a technique for fence building he had learned in Texas that was faster and stronger than the traditional method. She asked about his horse, whether the mare was getting enough rest and good feed after the long journey north. He assured her the horse was fine, but admitted he needed to check her hooves and make sure she had not picked up any stones or developed any cracks. "I have a decent farrier kit in the shed," Catherine offered. "You are welcome to use it if you need to." "That would be helpful," Vincent said. "Thank you." After breakfast, Vincent went to tend his horse while Catherine cleaned up the kitchen. The mare was grazing peacefully in the small paddock behind the barn, looking more rested than she had in weeks. Vincent checked her over carefully, running his hands down her legs to feel for heat or swelling, picking out her hooves and examining them for damage. She was sound, thank God, but she needed new shoes soon. He made a mental note to find a blacksmith in Aurora as soon as possible. He was brushing the mare's coat when Catherine appeared with a basket over her arm. "I need to go into town for supplies," she said. "Would you like to come? I could introduce you to some people who might know about work." Vincent hesitated. Going into town with Catherine would send a message to the people of Aurora, a message that he was not sure either of them was ready to send. But the alternative was staying here alone while she went to town, and that felt wrong too. Besides, he did need to find work, and having Catherine introduce him around would make things easier. "All right," he said. "Let me saddle the horse." "We can take the wagon," Catherine said. "That way we can bring back lumber if we find any. I want to build some proper frames for the hives, and maybe get some foundation wax to help the bees get started." So they hitched Catherine's old draft horse to the wagon and set off down the rutted road that led toward Aurora. The town was about 3 miles from Catherine's property, nestled in a valley where 2 creeks met and the land flattened out enough for farming. As they drove, Catherine pointed out neighboring properties and told Vincent about the people who lived there. The Kowalskis to the north, who raised pigs and kept to themselves. The Martinez family to the south, who had a big spread with cattle and sheep. The Johnsons across the creek, who ran a small sawmill and sold lumber to the mining camps. Aurora itself was larger than Vincent had expected, a proper town with a main street lined with businesses. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, and a schoolhouse. People moved along the boardwalks, going about their business, and Vincent saw several men in the worn clothes of miners heading toward the assay office with bags of ore samples. Catherine drove the wagon to the general store and set the brake. As she climbed down, several people called greetings to her, and Vincent noticed the curious looks they sent his way. He helped Catherine with her basket, following her into the store and trying not to feel like everyone was staring at them. The storekeeper was a heavy-set man with a thick beard and sharp eyes. "Morning, Miss Ashford," he said warmly. "What can I get for you today?" "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," Catherine replied. "I need flour, sugar, salt, and some coffee if you have any fresh roasted. Oh, and nails." "A couple pounds of nails." Mr. Peterson began pulling items from the shelves, but his attention kept drifting to Vincent. Finally, he could not contain his curiosity any longer. "Who is your friend, Miss Ashford?" "This is Vincent Mercer," Catherine said. "He is a cowboy passing through, and he helped me build new hives for my bees yesterday." Mr. Peterson's eyebrows went up. "New hives? That is wonderful news. Your father would be pleased to know you are keeping the bees going." "Mr. Mercer built 10 hives in a single afternoon," Catherine said, and there was unmistakable pride in her voice. "He is looking for work if you know anyone who might be hiring." Mr. Peterson stroked his beard thoughtfully. Well now, that is good timing. Jim Morrison over at the livery was just saying yesterday that he needs help. His back has been giving him trouble, and he cannot manage all the work by himself anymore. If you know horses and do not mind hard work, he would probably take you on. I know horses, Vincent said. Where can I find Mr. Morrison? Livery is at the end of the street on the left, Mr. Peterson said. Tell him I sent you, and mention that you are the fellow who built Miss Ashford's hives. Jim is a beekeeper himself, so that will go a long way with him. They finished getting Catherine's supplies, and Vincent carried the heavy bags out to the wagon while she settled her account. As they were loading everything, an older woman approached, her face lighting up when she saw Catherine. Catherine, dear, how wonderful to see you, the woman said, pulling Catherine into a quick embrace. I have been meaning to ride out to your place, but my arthritis has been acting up something terrible. It is good to see you too, Mrs. Henderson, Catherine said warmly. How are you feeling? Oh, I am managing, Mrs. Henderson said, but her eyes had already moved to Vincent with undisguised interest. And who is this handsome young man? Catherine made the introductions, and Vincent found himself shaking hands with Mrs. Henderson while she studied him like a horse she was considering buying. You built Catherine's hives, she asked, all 10 of them in one afternoon. Yes, madam, Vincent confirmed. Well, that is impressive, Mrs. Henderson said. Catherine, dear, you should bring Mr. Mercer to the church social on Saturday. We are having a box supper auction, and I know several young ladies who would be delighted to meet a hard-working young man with good manners. Catherine's cheeks flushed pink. I do not know if Mr. Mercer will still be in town on Saturday, she said quickly. But Vincent surprised himself by saying, if I am still here, I would be honored to attend. Mrs. Henderson beamed at him, and Catherine looked both pleased and flustered, which Vincent found endearing. They said their goodbyes to Mrs. Henderson and climbed back into the wagon, and as they drove toward the livery, Catherine said, You do not have to go to the social if you do not want to. Mrs. Henderson means well, but she has been trying to marry me off to every single man in the county since my father died. Do you not want to get married? Vincent asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Catherine was quiet for a moment, her hands tight on the reins. I do not want to marry someone just because it is expected, she said finally. I do not want to hand my property and my life over to a man who only sees me as a means to an end. If I marry, it will be because I choose to, because I find someone who respects me and cares about what I care about. That seems reasonable, Vincent said, and meant it. He had known too many women who had been forced into marriages they did not want, who had lost their freedom and their dreams to men who treated them like property. Catherine deserved better than that. The livery was a large building that smelled of horses and leather and hay. Jim Morrison turned out to be a wiry man in his 50s with graying hair and eyes that assessed Vincent with the careful attention of someone who knew horses better than he knew people. Vincent introduced himself, mentioned Mr. Peterson's recommendation, and explained that he was looking for work. Can you shoe a horse? Morrison asked bluntly. Yes, sir, Vincent said. I can also handle basic veterinary care, and I know how to train horses for saddle and harness. What about breaking green horses? I have done some of that, though I prefer working with horses that are not completely wild. I find patience works better than force. Morrison grunted, which Vincent took as approval. I pay fair wages, and I provide room and board if you need it. The work is steady, but it is not easy. You will be here from dawn until dark most days, and sometimes later if there is an emergency. That sounds fine to me, Vincent said. When can you start? Vincent glanced at Catherine, who was watching the exchange with interest. Tomorrow morning. He offered, Tomorrow morning it is, Morrison agreed. Be here at dawn and we will see what you are made of. They shook hands and Vincent felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had work. He had a place to stay. And most importantly, he had a reason to remain in Aurora at least for a while. When they climbed back into the wagon, Catherine was smiling. That went well, she said. It did, Vincent agreed. Thank you for bringing me into town. I do not think I would have found work that quickly on my own. Mr. Morrison is a good man, Catherine said as she guided the wagon back onto the main street. He will treat you fairly, and he knows everything there is to know about horses. You will learn a lot from him. They stopped at the sawmill on the way out of town, and Catherine bought lumber for building frames and foundation wax for the hives. Vincent helped load everything into the wagon, ignoring the curious stares from the men working at the mill. Word was going to spread fast about the stranger who had helped Catherine Ashford and was now working at the livery. Vincent knew how small towns worked. By nightfall, everyone in Aurora would know his name and have formed opinions about his intentions. The ride back to Catherine's property was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Vincent unloaded the lumber and supplies while Catherine unhitched the draft horse and turned it out to pasture. Then they stood together looking at the hives, watching the bees move in their busy, purposeful way. I suppose you will be moving to the livery tomorrow, Catherine said, not looking at him. I suppose so, Vincent agreed, but I could come out here sometimes if you want. Help you build the frames and get the hives fully set up. It would be a shame not to finish what we started. Catherine turned to look at him, and Vincent saw hope in her eyes mixed with caution. I would like that, she said. I would like that very much. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, building frames and cutting foundation wax into sheets that would give the bees a head start on building their combs. It was precise work that required steady hands and attention to detail, and Vincent found it deeply satisfying. Catherine worked beside him, her movements confident and sure, and they fell into the same easy rhythm they had found the day before. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, Vincent realized he did not want to leave. He wanted to stay here with Catherine, wanted to keep working with the bees and building things and talking about everything and nothing. But he had committed to starting work at the livery tomorrow morning, and he needed to honor that commitment. I should go, he said reluctantly. I need to get my things from the barn and ride into town before dark. Catherine nodded, but she looked disappointed. Will you come back on Sunday? She asked. After church? I will come back on Sunday, Vincent promised, and I will bring my tools. We can finish the frames and maybe start work on that fence you mentioned. They walked to the barn together, and Vincent gathered his few belongings and saddled his horse. When he led the mare outside, Catherine was waiting with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I packed you some food for the road, she said. It is not much, just bread and cheese and some apples, but I thought you might be hungry later. Vincent took the bundle, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Catherine, for everything. Thank you, Vincent, she replied. For the hives, and for staying when you could have just ridden on. It has meant more to me than you know. He wanted to kiss her. The impulse came over him suddenly and strongly, and it took all his willpower to resist. It was too soon, too fast, and Catherine deserved to be courted properly, not rushed into something because Vincent could not control his feelings. So instead, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell and swung up into the saddle. I will see you Sunday, he said. Sunday, Catherine echoed, and she stood there watching as he rode away, getting smaller and smaller in the distance until he crested a hill, and she was gone from sight. The room Jim Morrison showed Vincent at the livery was small and spare, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. It was not much, but it was clean and dry, and Vincent had stayed in far worse places. He unpacked his few belongings and ate the food Catherine had given him, and then he lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. His mind kept returning to Catherine, to the way she had looked standing among her bees with the sun in her hair, to the sound of her laugh when he had made some offhand joke while they were building frames. He thought about how natural it had felt to work beside her, how easy it was to talk to her about things that mattered. And he thought about the fear that lurked beneath all of it, the fear that he was not good enough for someone like her, that his restless nature would eventually drive him to leave and break both their hearts in the process. Vincent had spent years convincing himself that he was not the kind of man who could settle down, that he was too damaged by his past to build a future with anyone. But meeting Catherine had shaken that certainty. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to try. He wanted to be the kind of man who kept his promises and built things that lasted. He wanted to be worthy of the way Catherine looked at him, like he was someone worth believing in. He finally fell asleep with those thoughts swirling through his mind, and when he woke at dawn, he felt more determined than he had in years. He would work hard for Jim Morrison, prove himself reliable and skilled. He would go to church on Sunday and court Catherine properly, with patience and respect. And maybe, if he was lucky, she would give him a chance to show her that he was not just passing through, that he could be the kind of man who stayed. The work at the livery was everything Jim Morrison had promised: hard, steady, and demanding. Vincent spent his days shoeing horses, repairing tack, mucking stalls, and dealing with the endless stream of customers who needed their animals cared for. Morrison was a demanding boss, but a fair one, quick to point out mistakes, but equally quick to acknowledge good work. Vincent threw himself into the job, determined to prove that Morrison's faith in him was justified. The days passed quickly, filled with the rhythm of physical labor and the satisfaction of working with horses. Vincent had always liked horses better than people, found them easier to understand and more honest in their reactions. A horse would let you know exactly how it felt about you, and if you earned its trust, that trust was solid and lasting. People were more complicated, full of hidden agendas and unspoken expectations. But when Sunday finally came, Vincent woke with a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with a woman with green eyes and honey-colored hair. He washed carefully at the pump behind the livery, shaved with the straight razor he kept wrapped in oilcloth, and put on his cleanest shirt. Jim Morrison watched him primp with barely concealed amusement. "You are courting Miss Ashford," Morrison said. It was not a question. Vincent felt his ears burn. "I am planning to call on her, yes." "Good," Morrison said, surprising him. "Catherine Ashford is a fine woman, and she has had a hard time of it these past couple years. She deserves someone who will treat her right and appreciate what she has to offer. You treat her well, or you will answer to me and about half the town." "I will," Vincent promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. The church service was held in a white clapboard building with a tall steeple and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the pews. Vincent arrived early and sat in the back, feeling awkward and out of place among the families and couples who filled the church with their chatter and laughter. He had not attended church regularly since his mother died, and being here now brought back memories he had tried to bury. But then Catherine arrived, and everything else faded into the background. She was wearing a dress of pale blue that made her eyes look even greener, and her hair was pinned up in a way that showed the graceful curve of her neck. She saw Vincent and smiled, and he felt that smile all the way down to his boots. She made her way through the crowd and slid into the pew beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of honey and lavender that seemed to cling to her. "Good morning," she whispered. "Good morning," Vincent whispered back, and suddenly church did not seem like such a bad place to be. The service was long, with hymns and prayers and a sermon about stewardship and caring for the gifts God had given. Vincent tried to pay attention, but he kept getting distracted by Catherine's presence beside him, by the way her voice blended with his when they sang, by the occasional brush of her arm against his. When the service finally ended, they filed out with the rest of the congregation, and Vincent found himself shaking hands with what felt like half the town. Everyone wanted to meet the cowboy who had built Catherine's hives, and Vincent endured a barrage of questions and introductions with as much grace as he could muster. He met the Martinez family, who invited him to dinner sometime. He met Pastor Williams, who thanked him for helping Catherine and suggested he might consider joining the men's Bible study. He met at least a dozen other people whose names he immediately forgot, overwhelmed by the sheer friendliness of the community. Finally, Catherine rescued him, taking his arm and steering him away from the crowd. "You look like you are about to bolt," she said with amusement. "I am not used to so many people being interested in me," Vincent admitted. "On the trail, you can go days without having a real conversation with anyone." "Well, you are the most interesting thing to happen in Aurora for months," Catherine said. "People are curious about you. They want to know if you are going to stay, and if you are staying, what your intentions are regarding me." Vincent stopped walking and turned to face her. "What do you want my intentions to be?" Catherine's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze steadily. "I want you to be honest with me," she said. "I do not need pretty words or false promises. I just need to know where I stand." "I want to court you," Vincent said, his voice low so only she could hear. "I want to call on you properly, spend time with you, get to know you better. And if things go well, if you feel the same way I do, then I want to build a life here. With you." Catherine's eyes went wide, and for a moment Vincent feared he had said too much, moved too fast. But then she smiled, a smile so bright and genuine that it made his chest ache. "Then you should take me home," she said. "We have frames to finish and a fence to mend, and I believe you promised to come back today." They walked to where Catherine had tied her wagon, and Vincent helped her up onto the seat before climbing up beside her. As they drove out of town, Vincent felt like he was floating, untethered from the earth by the sheer joy of knowing that Catherine wanted him to stay, that she was giving him a chance to prove himself. The afternoon passed in a blur of work and conversation and stolen glances. They finished building the last of the frames and installed them in the hives, giving the bees everything they needed to thrive. Then they moved to the fence on the east side of the property, where several posts had rotted through, and the wire was sagging dangerously. Vincent showed Catherine the technique he had learned in Texas, digging the post holes deeper and setting the posts in gravel for better drainage. It was hard work, made harder by the heat of the afternoon sun, but they worked steadily side by side. As they worked, they talked. Catherine told him about her dreams of expanding the bee operation, maybe selling honey to markets beyond Aurora, perhaps even shipping it to Denver. Vincent talked about his desire to own his own ranch someday, to raise horses instead of just caring for other people's animals. They discovered they both loved thunderstorms and hated dishonest people. They both preferred coffee to tea, summer to winter, and dogs to cats. "You want children?" Catherine asked suddenly, and then immediately looked embarrassed. "I am sorry, that was too forward." "No, it is a fair question," Vincent said, driving a post deeper into the ground with the flat of his shovel. "And yes, I do, someday, if I find the right woman to have them with." Catherine was quiet for a moment, and when Vincent looked over at her, she was smiling. "Good," she said softly. That is good to know. They worked until the sun began to set, and then Catherine insisted Vincent stay for supper. They ate on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple, and Vincent realized he had not felt this content in years. Everything about this felt right, the work and the conversation and the easy companionship. Catherine felt like coming home, like finding something he had not known he was looking for. When it was finally time to leave, Vincent stood on the porch with Catherine, neither of them quite willing to say goodbye. "When will you come back?" she asked. "Next Sunday," Vincent suggested, "unless you need help before then." "I have Wednesday afternoons off, and I could ride out after work some evenings if you want." "Come whenever you can," Catherine said. "I like having you here." Vincent took her hand, holding it gently in his own. "I like being here," he said, "more than I can properly express." Catherine squeezed his hand, and they stood there in the gathering darkness, just holding hands and looking at each other. Finally, Vincent forced himself to let go and step away. "I should go before it gets too dark to see the road." "Be safe," Catherine said. "And Vincent, thank you for everything." "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay," Vincent replied, and then he was mounting his horse and riding away, already counting the days until he could come back. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that Vincent found deeply satisfying. He worked hard at the livery during the week, learning everything Jim Morrison could teach him about horses and building a reputation in town as someone reliable and skilled. Then on Wednesdays and Sundays, he would ride out to Catherine's property and spend the day working alongside her, helping with whatever needed to be done. They repaired the rest of the fence, and then they built a new chicken coop to replace the one that had been falling apart. They worked in Catherine's garden, weeding and watering and harvesting vegetables that Catherine preserved in jars for the winter. And they tended the bees together, checking the hives regularly and marveling at how quickly the colonies were growing now that they had proper homes. But more than the work, Vincent treasured the time they spent just talking and being together. They would sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the stars come out, sharing stories about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Catherine taught him about the different wildflowers that grew in the hills, and how each one gave the honey a different flavor. Vincent taught her the constellations his mother had shown him as a child, and told her stories about the different places he had traveled. Slowly, carefully, they were building something together. And with each passing day, Vincent felt more certain that this was what he wanted, that Catherine was who he wanted to spend his life with. The church social that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned arrived on a warm Saturday evening in July. Vincent had been nervous about attending, worried that he would feel out of place among the established families of Aurora. But Catherine had insisted, saying it would be good for him to get to know more people in the community, and Vincent found he could not deny her anything. The social was held in the field behind the church, with lanterns strung between the trees and long tables set up for the food. It seemed like the entire town had turned out, families with children running and playing, young couples walking arm in arm, older folks sitting in chairs and watching the festivities with benevolent smiles. Vincent arrived with Catherine, who carried a decorated box containing the supper she had prepared for the auction. The box supper auction was a tradition Vincent had heard about but never participated in. The unmarried women of the community would prepare suppers and pack them in decorated boxes, and then the men would bid on the boxes without knowing who had made them. The highest bidder would win the box, and the privilege of sharing the meal with the woman who had prepared it. It was meant to be fun and slightly mysterious, a way for young people to socialize and court under the watchful eyes of the community. Vincent had no intention of bidding on any box except Catherine's. She had told him exactly how she had decorated hers. A simple wooden box tied with a blue ribbon that matched her dress, so he would know which one to bid on. As the auction began, Vincent positioned himself near the front, his money ready. The auctioneer was Mr. Peterson from the general store, who threw himself into the role with enthusiasm. He held up each box, describing its decorations and speculating wildly about what culinary delights might be inside, while the men in the crowd shouted out their bids. The first few boxes went quickly, claimed by young men who seemed to know exactly which boxes belonged to which women. Then the auctioneer held up Catherine's box with the blue ribbon, and Vincent felt his pulse quicken. "Now here is a fine box," Mr. Peterson declared. "Decorated simple but elegant, just like the lady who made it. Who will start the bidding?" $1, Vincent called out, which was a generous starting bid. "I have $1, Mr. Peterson said. Do I hear two?" $2, said another voice, and Vincent turned to see a young man he did not recognize, dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as someone from out of town. Vincent gritted his teeth. $3. $4, the stranger countered immediately. The crowd had gone quiet, sensing drama. Catherine stood off to the side with the other women, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the bidding with wide eyes. Vincent caught her gaze, and she gave him a small nod that he interpreted as encouragement. $5, Vincent said firmly. The stranger hesitated, and Vincent allowed himself a moment of hope. $5 was a significant sum for a box supper, more than most men would spend. But then the stranger said, $6, and Vincent realized this was not about the food. This was about Catherine. $10, Vincent said, and the crowd gasped. Mr. Peterson looked startled. "Did you say $10, son?" $10, Vincent confirmed, staring at the stranger with a look that dared him to bid higher. The stranger met his gaze for a long moment, then shook his head and stepped back. "It is yours," he said, though he did not sound happy about it. "Sold to Vincent Mercer for $10, Mr. Peterson declared, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Vincent paid his $10 and claimed the box, and Catherine came forward with her cheeks flushed and her eyes shining. $10, she whispered as they walked away from the crowd. "Vincent, that is too much." "It is worth it," Vincent said simply. "You are worth it." They found a spot under a tree away from the main crowd and sat down to share the meal Catherine had prepared. She had made fried chicken, potato salad, biscuits with honey butter, and apple pie for dessert. It was delicious, but Vincent barely tasted it. He was too focused on Catherine, on the way the lantern light played across her face, on the sound of her laugh when he told her a funny story about a stubborn mule he had dealt with at the livery. "That man who was bidding against you," Catherine said eventually. "That was Daniel Hutchinson. His father owns one of the largest mining operations in the area, and he has been trying to court me for months." Vincent felt a surge of jealousy that he tried to tamp down. "Has he now?" "I have made it clear I am not interested," Catherine said, reaching over to take Vincent's hand. "He does not understand that some things cannot be bought, no matter how much money you have, but you seem to understand that just fine." "I spent $10 on a box supper," Vincent pointed out. "That seems like buying to me." "You spent $10 to share a meal with me," Catherine corrected. "There is a difference. You are not trying to buy me, Vincent. You are trying to spend time with me, to get to know me. That matters." They sat there under the tree holding hands and talking until the social began to wind down and families started heading home. Vincent walked Catherine to her wagon, and before she climbed up she stood on her toes and kissed him on the cheek. It was a brief, chaste kiss, but it sent electricity through Vincent's entire body. "Thank you for tonight," Catherine said softly, "for the bid and for being exactly who you are." Vincent touched his cheek where she had kissed him, feeling dazed and elated. "Can I come see you tomorrow?" "I would be disappointed if you did not," Catherine replied with a smile. Vincent watched her drive away, and then he walked back to the livery feeling like his feet were not quite touching the ground. Jim Morrison was still awake when Vincent got back, sitting on the porch of his own small house and smoking a pipe. "I heard about the bid," Morrison said, grinning around his pipe stem. $10 for a box supper. You have got it bad, son." "I am not denying it," Vincent said, sinking into the chair beside Morrison. "She is the best thing that has ever happened to me, Jim. I do not want to mess this up." "Then do not," Morrison said simply. "Treat her right, work hard, save your money, and build a future worth having. It is not complicated, Vincent. It just takes commitment and follow through." Vincent nodded, taking the words to heart. He had spent so many years drifting that the idea of commitment had seemed foreign, almost frightening. But now, thinking about Catherine, about building a life with her, commitment did not feel frightening at all. It felt like exactly what he wanted. August arrived with blazing heat and thunderstorms that rolled through the mountains in the late afternoons. The bees thrived, filling the hives with honey and wax, and Catherine was able to harvest her first batch of honey from the new hives. Vincent helped her extract the honey, cranking the extractor while Catherine cut the caps from the frames and loaded them into the machine. The honey flowed golden and thick into jars, and Catherine could barely contain her excitement. "This is 3 times what I was able to harvest from the tin cans last year," she said, holding up a jar to the light. "Vincent, do you realize what this means? I can actually make money from the bees now. I can pay off some of my father's debts and maybe even expand next year." Vincent pulled her into a hug, not caring that they were both sticky with honey. "I am so proud of you," he said against her hair. "You did this, Catherine. You kept those bees alive when anyone else would have given up." "We did this," Catherine corrected, pulling back to look at him. "I could not have done it without you, Vincent. Without the hives you built, none of this would have been possible." They stood there in the honey house, holding each other, and Vincent knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with this woman. She was strong and determined and kind, and she saw him not as a drifter or a hired hand but as a partner, someone worth building something with. He wanted to ask her to marry him right then and there, but he held back. He wanted to do this right, wanted to have something to offer her beyond his labor and his devotion. So Vincent kept working at the livery, saving every penny he could spare. Jim Morrison had been paying him fair wages, and Vincent lived frugally, spending money only on necessities and putting the rest aside. He had a goal now, a purpose that drove him to work harder than he ever had before. He wanted to buy land of his own, wanted to have something solid to offer Catherine when he finally asked for her hand. By September, the leaves on the aspens were turning gold, and the air had taken on the crisp edge that promised winter was coming. Catherine had sold most of her honey harvest, earning enough money to pay off her debts and buy supplies for the winter. She was happier than Vincent had ever seen her, and he took deep satisfaction in knowing he had played a part in that happiness. They were working together one Sunday afternoon, repairing the roof on the barn before the snow came, when Catherine suddenly said, "Vincent, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Vincent said, hammering a nail into a shingle. "What do you see when you think about the future? 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where do you want to be?" Vincent set down his hammer and turned to look at her. She was sitting on the roof beside him, her hair tied back with a scarf and her hands dirty from the work. She looked beautiful and earnest, and Vincent knew this was an important question, one that deserved an honest answer. "I see us together," he said simply. "I see us working side by side, building something that lasts." Maybe a ranch with horses and cattle, maybe expanding your bee operation, maybe both. I see us with children, teaching them the things our parents taught us. I see a life of hard work and purpose, of shared struggles and shared joys. That is what I want, Catherine. I want a future with you. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. That is what I want too, she whispered. I have wanted that for months, but I was afraid to say it out loud, afraid I was reading too much into what we have. Vincent reached over and took her hand. You are not reading too much into anything, he assured her. I love you, Catherine. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you kneeling in the grass with your bees, and every day since then I have fallen a little deeper. I love you too, Catherine said, and then she was kissing him, a real kiss this time, full of promise and passion and hope. Vincent wrapped his arms around her and kissed her back, tasting honey and sunshine and everything good he had ever wanted. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning, Vincent said, I want to marry you, Catherine, but I want to do this right. I want to have land of my own, something I can bring to the marriage so I am not just relying on you and your property. Will you wait for me while I save up enough to buy a piece of land? I have waited this long, Catherine said, cupping his face in her hands. I can wait a little longer. But Vincent, you need to understand something. I do not care about the land or the money. I care about you. I would marry you tomorrow if you asked me, regardless of what you have or do not have. I know, Vincent said, kissing her forehead. But this is important to me. I want to be able to stand before you as your equal, not as someone you are rescuing or supporting. Can you understand that? I can, Catherine said softly. And I love you all the more for it. They finished working on the roof in comfortable silence, stealing kisses whenever they got the chance, making plans for a future that suddenly seemed bright and attainable. Vincent felt like he had been wandering in the wilderness for years, and now he had finally found his way home. Winter came hard and fast to Colorado that year, with snowstorms that piled drifts against the buildings and temperatures that dropped well below freezing. Vincent worried about Catherine alone on her property, but she assured him she was prepared, with enough firewood and food stored up to last until spring. Still, he rode out to check on her whenever the weather permitted, helping her break ice in the water troughs and making sure the bees were buttoned up tight in their hives. The bees would spend the winter clustered together in the center of the hive, shivering their wing muscles to generate heat and eating the honey they had stored during the warmer months. As long as they had enough food and the hives were properly insulated, they would survive until spring. Vincent and Catherine had wrapped the hives in burlap and straw for extra insulation, and they checked them regularly to make sure everything was holding up. On Christmas Eve, Vincent arrived at Catherine's house with a gift tucked into his saddlebag. She welcomed him with hot coffee and fresh bread, and they sat by the fire while the wind howled outside. Vincent gave her the gift, a wooden box he had carved himself with intricate patterns of honeybees and flowers covering every surface. Inside the box was a small silver ring with a tiny amber stone that reminded Vincent of honey. It is not an engagement ring, Vincent said as Catherine lifted the ring from the box with trembling fingers. Not yet, but it is a promise ring. A promise that I am going to marry you as soon as I can buy that land and have something to offer you. Catherine slipped the ring onto her finger and threw her arms around Vincent's neck. It is perfect, she said, her voice thick with tears. You are perfect, Vincent Mercer, and I cannot wait to be your wife. They spent Christmas together, just the two of them, cooking a simple meal and exchanging small gifts and making plans for the future. Vincent had never been happier, never felt more at peace. This was what he had been searching for all those years on the trail, this sense of belonging and purpose and love. The winter passed slowly, with Vincent working at the livery and saving every penny, visiting Catherine whenever he could. In February, Jim Morrison offered to sell Vincent a partnership in the livery business, saying he was getting too old to manage everything himself and could use a younger partner to help carry the load. Vincent accepted gratefully, knowing that having a stake in the business would give him more income and more stability. He paid Morrison what he could up front and agreed to pay the rest over time. By the time spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Vincent had saved enough money to make an offer on a piece of land adjacent to Catherine's property. It was only 20 acres, but it had good water and grazing, and it would be enough to start a small horse operation. The owner, an older man who was moving to Denver to live with his daughter, accepted Vincent's offer, and suddenly Vincent was a landowner. He rode to Catherine's house that same day, unable to contain his excitement. She was working in her garden, turning over the soil and preparing it for spring planting, and she looked up with a smile when she heard his horse approach. "I bought the land," Vincent said, swinging down from the saddle. "The 20 acres to your east. We will be neighbors." Catherine dropped her spade and ran to him, and Vincent caught her up in his arms and spun her around. "Does this mean what I think it means?" she asked breathlessly. Vincent set her down gently and dropped to one knee right there in the muddy garden. He pulled out the engagement ring he had been carrying in his pocket for weeks, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had cost him a significant portion of his savings. "Catherine Ashford," he said, looking up at her with his heart in his eyes. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the mother of my children? Will you build a life with me?" "Yes," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Vincent slipped the ring onto her finger beside the promise ring, and then he stood and kissed her with all the love and passion he had been holding back for months. Catherine kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands tangling in his hair, and Vincent felt like his heart might burst from sheer joy. They were married in May, in the same white church where Vincent had first sat beside Catherine all those months ago. It was a simple ceremony, with Jim Morrison standing up as Vincent's best man and Mrs. Henderson serving as Catherine's matron of honor. The entire town turned out to witness the wedding, and afterward there was a celebration with music and dancing, and more food than Vincent had ever seen in one place. Vincent and Catherine danced under the stars, held each other close, and whispered promises about the future they would build together. When the celebration finally wound down, they rode back to Catherine's house, which was now their house, and Vincent carried his bride across the threshold like he had seen other men do. They made love for the first time that night, gentle and awkward and perfect, learning each other's bodies with patience and care. The next morning, Vincent woke with Catherine in his arms and knew that this was exactly where he was meant to be. He had spent so many years searching for something he could not name, and now he understood that what he had been searching for was this: love, partnership, home. They combined their properties and their resources, creating a small but thriving operation. Catherine expanded her bee colonies, eventually growing from 10 hives to 50, producing honey that was sought after throughout Colorado for its quality and unique flavor. Vincent built up a horse breeding operation, specializing in sturdy, reliable mounts that could handle the mountain terrain. They worked hard, side by side, just as Vincent had envisioned. Their first child was born the following spring, a healthy boy they named Thomas, after Catherine's father. Vincent held his son for the first time and felt something shift in him, a deepening of his commitment not just to Catherine, but to the future they were building together. He wanted to give Thomas everything he had never had: stability, security, a father who was present and engaged. 2 years later, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, and then 2 years after that, another son they called James. The house that had once seemed too quiet and empty was now filled with the noise and chaos of children, with laughter and tears and endless questions. Vincent thrived in the chaos, discovering a patience and gentleness he had not known he possessed. He taught his children to ride horses and care for the bees, showed them how to read the weather and understand the land. Catherine taught them to read books and do arithmetic, to appreciate beauty and kindness. Together, they raised their children to be strong and capable and compassionate, to understand the value of hard work and the importance of community. The years passed, marked by the rhythm of the seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. First steps and first words, first days of school and graduations. There were hard times too, years when drought threatened the hay crop or disease swept through the hive colonies. There were losses and setbacks, moments when Vincent wondered if they would be able to hold on to what they had built. But through it all, Vincent and Catherine faced everything together, supporting each other through the difficulties and celebrating the triumphs. Their love deepened and matured, growing from the passionate infatuation of young romance into something steadier and more enduring. They learned each other's rhythms, understood each other's silences, and built a partnership that was stronger than any challenge they faced. Jim Morrison eventually retired fully, selling Vincent his remaining share of the livery, and Vincent expanded the business to include horse training and boarding. The Mercer name became synonymous with quality and reliability, and people came from all over the region to buy horses from Vincent or honey from Catherine. The 10 hives Vincent had built that first day became the foundation of something much larger than either of them had imagined. Catherine's honey won awards at county fairs and state competitions, and she was frequently asked to speak at agricultural meetings about her beekeeping methods. Vincent's horses were sought after by ranchers and farmers alike, prized for their intelligence and temperament. But more than the professional success, more than the material prosperity they achieved, what mattered most to Vincent was the life they had built together. He loved coming home at the end of each day to find Catherine waiting for him, loved sitting on the porch with her after the children were in bed and talking about everything and nothing. He loved the way she still looked at him, even after all these years, like he was someone worth believing in. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Vincent surprised Catherine by rebuilding the original 10 hives he had constructed that first day. They had been replaced over the years as they wore out, but Vincent had saved some of the original wood, and he used it to create 10 miniature replica hives that he displayed in a glass case in their living room. "I want our grandchildren to know the story," he told Catherine as she examined the replicas with tears in her eyes. "I want them to understand that sometimes the biggest changes in life come from the smallest acts of kindness. You were keeping bees in tin cans, and I built you proper hives. That one decision changed everything for both of us." "You changed everything for me," Catherine said, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "You gave me hope when I thought I had lost everything. You showed me that love was not just something that happened in stories, but something real and tangible that could be built and nurtured and sustained." They stood there in their living room, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created together. The photographs on the walls showing their children growing up, the furniture they had bought piece by piece over the years, the books they had read together on quiet winter evenings. It was not a grand or glamorous life, but it was theirs, and it was good. Thomas grew up to take over the horse operation, bringing his own innovations and ideas while respecting the foundation his father had built. Rose became a teacher in Aurora, educating a new generation of children and carrying on her mother's love of learning. James studied agriculture at the university in Boulder and returned home to help expand the honey business, developing new methods for queen rearing and hive management that increased production and quality. Vincent and Catherine became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching with pride as their family grew and spread through the community like the roots of an ancient tree. They were respected elders in Aurora, sought out for advice and wisdom, remembered not just for their professional success, but for the way they had lived their lives with integrity and compassion. On a warm summer evening when Vincent was 72 and Catherine 70, they sat together on the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the sound of bees humming in the hives drifted through the air like music. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked suddenly. "Giving up the wandering life? You could have seen so much more of the country, had so many adventures." Vincent reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had held that first Sunday after he built the hives, the hand that wore his ring and bore the marks of decades of hard work. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You are my adventure, Catherine. Building this life with you, raising our children, creating something that will last beyond us, that has been the greatest adventure I could ever have imagined." Catherine squeezed his hand, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead. Vincent thought about that day so many years ago when he had ridden into Aurora with nothing but a tired horse and a few dollars in his pocket. He thought about seeing Catherine kneeling in the grass with her bees, about the decision to stop and help instead of riding on. That decision had been the hinge on which his entire life had turned. Everything good that had come after, every moment of joy and satisfaction and love, could be traced back to that single choice to build 10 hives for a woman he had just met. It seemed impossible that so much could come from such a small beginning, but that was the nature of love, Vincent supposed. It started small, just a seed planted in fertile ground, and if you nurtured it with patience and care, it could grow into something magnificent. The bees had taught him that in their way. Each bee was small and insignificant on its own, but together they could create something remarkable, something that sustained life and brought sweetness into the world. Love was like that too. The small daily acts of kindness and consideration, the steady accumulation of shared experiences and weathered storms, those were what built a marriage that lasted. Vincent pulled Catherine closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that as the night deepened around them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The hives hummed in the darkness, the bees settling in for the night, and Vincent felt at peace. He had been a cowboy once, a drifter with no home and no purpose. But he was a cowboy no longer. He was a husband, a father, a grandfather, a pillar of his community. He was a man who had found his place in the world and filled it with love and purpose and meaning. And it had all started with 10 hives built by Sundown for a woman keeping bees in tin cans. Years continued to pass, and Vincent and Catherine grew old together with grace and dignity. Vincent's hands, which had been so strong and capable when he was young, became gnarled with arthritis, but he could still work when he needed to, still help his sons and grandsons with the horses and the hives. Catherine's hair turned completely silver, and she moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind stayed sharp, and her spirit remained unbroken. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a huge party that brought together their entire extended family and half the town of Aurora. Their children and grandchildren gave speeches about the legacy Vincent and Catherine had built, about the example they had set for what marriage and partnership could be. Vincent sat there listening, holding Catherine's hand, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had been given. 50 years, Catherine whispered to him during the party. Can you believe it has been 50 years since you built those hives? Best 50 years of my life, Vincent replied, kissing her temple. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, even the hard parts. Catherine asked with a slight smile. Especially the hard parts, Vincent said. The hard parts taught us what we were made of. They showed us that we could face anything together. As the evening wore on and the party finally began to wind down, Vincent stood up with some difficulty and called for everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, and all eyes turned to him. I just want to say something, Vincent began, his voice not as strong as it once was, but still carrying weight. When I rode into Aurora 52 years ago, I was lost. I did not know it at the time, but I was a man without purpose or direction, just drifting from place to place looking for something I could not name. And then I met Catherine, and everything changed. He paused, looking down at his wife with such love that several people in the audience wiped at their eyes. She was keeping bees in tin cans, trying to hold on to the last piece of her father's legacy, and I built her proper hives. 10 hives by sundown. That was my promise. But what I did not know then was that in building those hives, I was really building a foundation for our life together. Every nail I drove, every board I cut, was a step toward the future we would share. Vincent's voice grew stronger as he continued. I want everyone here, especially my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to understand something important. Love is not just a feeling. It is a choice you make every single day. It is showing up and doing the work, even when you are tired or frustrated or scared. It is building something together, brick by brick, day by day, until you have created a life worth living. He looked around at the assembled family, at the faces of the people who had come from his and Catherine's union, at the legacy they had built together. Catherine and I have been blessed beyond measure. We have had a good life, a full life, and we have each other to thank for that. We chose each other and we kept choosing each other through everything that came our way. That is the secret if there is one. Choose love every single day and build something that lasts. The room erupted in applause and Vincent sat down, suddenly exhausted. Catherine leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. That was beautiful, she said softly, and true. It is all true, Vincent replied. Every word. Vincent lived to be 87 years old, and when he finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep with Catherine beside him. The entire town of Aurora turned out for his funeral, and the church was filled to overflowing with people whose lives he had touched. His children and grandchildren spoke about his kindness, his work ethic, his unwavering commitment to family and community. But mostly they spoke about his love for Catherine, about the way he had devoted his life to making her happy and building a partnership that had been the foundation of everything else. Catherine lived for 3 more years after Vincent's death, and while those years were harder and lonelier than any she had known, she took comfort in the family they had built and the legacy they had left. She spent her time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about Vincent and the early days of their marriage, making sure they understood where they had come from and what it had taken to build the life they now enjoyed. On what would have been their 55th wedding anniversary, Catherine asked her grandson James to take her out to see the hives. They walked slowly through the apiary, now much expanded from the original 10 hives Vincent had built, and Catherine stood there listening to the bees hum in the warm summer air. Your grandfather built the first 10 hives right here, she told James, pointing to a spot near the barn. I was keeping the bees in tin cans, and he stopped to help even though he did not know me, even though he had no reason to care. That kindness changed both our lives. It changed all our lives, James said, gesturing to encompass not just the apiary but the entire property, the thriving business, the family that had grown from that first meeting. None of us would be here if Grandpa had not stopped that day. Catherine smiled, her eyes distant with memory. He used to say that the bees taught him about love, she said. That each small act of kindness and care was like a single bee, insignificant on its own but capable of creating something remarkable when combined with others. He was right about that. We built our marriage one day at a time, one small act of love at a time, until we had created something bigger and more beautiful than either of us could have imagined. When Catherine passed away in her sleep, a few months later, she was buried beside Vincent in the Aurora Cemetery, their graves marked with a simple headstone that bore both their names and a carving of a beehive. At the funeral, their family gathered to remember not just two individuals but a partnership that had spanned more than half a century and left an indelible mark on everyone who had known them. The land and businesses they had built were divided among their children and grandchildren, each taking on responsibility for different aspects of the operation. But they all agreed that the original 10 hive spots would be preserved and maintained as a memorial to Vincent and Catherine, a reminder of where it all began. And so the years continued to pass, and new generations were born and grew up hearing the story of the cowboy who had found a woman keeping bees in tin cans and built her 10 proper hives by sundown. They heard about how that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love story that had sustained two people through 52 years of marriage, through joys and sorrows, triumphs and trials. The story became a legend in Aurora, told and retold until everyone in town knew it by heart. Parents told it to their children as an example of the power of kindness and commitment. Couples getting married asked to have their weddings at the same church where Vincent and Catherine had exchanged vows, hoping to capture some of the magic that had blessed that union. The 10 hive spots on the Mercer property became something of a pilgrimage site for beekeepers from around the state, who would come to see where it all began and pay their respects to the couple who had helped establish Colorado as a major honey-producing region. The hives themselves were maintained by Catherine's descendants, who took pride in continuing the work she and Vincent had started. On the property, in the house Vincent and Catherine had shared for so many years, their great-great-grandchildren played in rooms that still bore the marks of all the lives that had been lived there. The banister that Vincent had carved with beehive patterns, the kitchen where Catherine had taught 3 generations of children to bake bread, the porch where 2 people had sat countless evenings watching the sun set behind the mountains. The house was full of ghosts, but they were happy ghosts, the echoes of laughter and love and lives well lived. And on warm summer evenings, if you sat very still on that porch and listened carefully, you could almost hear the sound of 2 voices murmuring in the darkness, the cowboy and his beekeeper, still building something beautiful together, even in memory. The legacy of Vincent and Catherine Mercer lived on not just in their descendants or their businesses, but in the example they had set for what love could be when it was given freely and tended carefully. They had proven that you did not need grand gestures or perfect circumstances to build something lasting. All you needed was willingness to show up, to do the work, to choose love over and over again even when it was hard. Vincent had been a cowboy, a man more comfortable with horses than people, a drifter who had spent years searching for something he could not name. Catherine had been a woman alone, struggling to hold on to her father's legacy with nothing but determination and tin cans full of bees. Neither of them had been looking for love when they found each other. But once they did, they recognized it for the precious gift it was and spent the rest of their lives honoring and nurturing it. In the end, that was the real story, not just that a cowboy had built hives for a woman, but that two people had built a life together, brick by brick and day by day, creating something that would outlast them both. The 10 hives Vincent built by sundown were just the beginning, the foundation upon which everything else was constructed. But what they built together, the love and the family and the legacy, that would endure for generations to come, a testament to the power of kindness, commitment, and two hearts that had chosen to beat as one. And somewhere, in whatever place people go when this life is done, Vincent Mercer was still holding Catherine's hand, still marveling at the miracle of having found her among all the vast loneliness of the world, still grateful beyond words that he had stopped that day instead of riding on. He had built her 10 hives by sundown, and in return, she had given him a lifetime of love and purpose and belonging. It was the best trade he had ever made, and he would make it again without hesitation if given the chance. Their story was complete, their lives lived fully and well, their love proven and tested and found true. The cowboy and his beekeeper had found each other, built a life together, and left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire and guide those who came after them. It was everything they could have hoped for, and more than either of them had dreamed possible on that summer day, when Vincent first saw Catherine kneeling in the grass with her bees in tin cans, and decided to stop and help. That decision, that single moment of compassion and connection, had changed everything. And that, in the end, was the most important lesson of all, that we never know which small acts of kindness might change the entire trajectory of our lives, or the lives of others. All we can do is choose to stop to help, to reach out when we see someone in need. The rest, as Vincent and Catherine proved, takes care of itself, unfolding in ways we cannot predict but can only gratefully embrace. Their love story was complete, and it was good. The cowboy had found his home, the beekeeper had found her partner, and together they had built something that would last long after they were gone. 10 hives by sundown had become a lifetime of love, and that was exactly as it should be.